It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, I'd like to start with you. While the partisan budget debate rages on, it seems like the most significant crisis ever to face humanity, that being the catastrophic consequences of climate change, can hardly get any serious political airtime in DC. How is it possible that we still don't have a political consensus to take this existential threat seriously?
Well, Dave, there's no doubt in my mind that this is an absolutely crucial set of questions you're asking. I think the time for debating whether or not something is happening is long past, and we really have to understand how we're going to deal with it and cope with it. And you know, I enjoy politics. I enjoy public policy. I have spent a lot of my life engaged in it one way or another. One thing I know, and that is these long-term issues are very difficult for the political process to cope with. It's just too far out. You know, elections in the House are every 2 years, the president every 4, the Senate every 6. And unless someone really takes a decades-long view of this, there's just too many other things that interfere. And so I actually think we have to look for better models to understand it. The notion that somehow the ice caps are melting is a long ways away in distance and in time, and it's hard for people to really, I think, understand. Yeah, I think one of the best examples I've seen in a long time is actually on Nantucket, where they created a group called Envision Resilience. And when you think about it, any island, and particularly Nantucket in the north, sits out there in the ocean in the Northeast, is very sensitive to rising sea levels. So they actually didn't do their own science. They took the NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration's numbers for 2060, 2080, and 2100. And those numbers say that the sea level is going to rise around Nantucket by 6.5 feet in 2060. By 4 feet in 2060, 6.5 feet by 2080, and over 9 feet by 2100. And like I said, it's a long ways away, but if you don't start thinking about the consequences now, you just run out of time. For years, before I got to the Eastern Shore, I had a house in Bethany. Nobody would have thought to build a house near the ocean in Bethany that wasn't on pilings, because when storms come up, the water flows across the highway all the way to the bay. And you simply, for the houses to survive or have a chance of surviving, you built them on pilings. But that decision was made decades ago, and it's just accepted today. And so what this project does in Nantucket is actually show people the consequences of 4, 6, and 9 foot sea level rises on a community whose economy depends on a town with ships and stores and restaurants, many of which could well be underwater. And so there's students working on new designs that would protect new structures, allow new structures to form. But I cite it because I honestly think we need this Envision Resilience here in Talbot County, over in Annapolis, where we know, because when big storms hit, we know what kind of flooding occurs. That's the norm in 20, 40, 60 years from now. And until you can actually see the consequence of the rising sea levels, you can't appreciate how much work has to be done. And when you see how much work has to be done just to deal with the known facts, I think it will motivate people to think much more seriously about the climate change issues and the kinds of actions we need to take to try to slow this or reduce the consequences in the out years. But the political process is very tough. And I think as voters, we've got to hold candidates' feet to the proverbial fire on this issue. They have to take a longer term perspective on this, even if it extends beyond their term in office. But that's asking a lot for public officials.
Al, it seems like every month there's a natural disaster that is the result of climate change. You would think that that would be enough ammunition to get the attention of politicians and voters. What's going on? Why is that not being much more just talked about?
Climate change is sort of an underlying crisis for most people. It's not an immediate one. We have a political system that responds to crises. How many times are we up against a deadline, as we are now, because the country's going to not be able to pay its bills unless we raise the debt ceiling? That gets Congress to act eventually and usually. But I think about, this year we had this catastrophic collapse of a building in Florida. The environment is sort of like that, climate change. There were reports over the last few years, I believe, that the foundation was in trouble, that it was, the building could collapse. Nobody paid any attention to it until it happened. The second point is the environment really is a pretty new issue in the political arena. The EPA is only 50 years old. It's probably only been in the last 20, 30 years that even people like us have really become aware of the dangers of climate change. But the third point I want to make, it's not really a front burner issue for most Americans, particularly if you get off the coast and you're in the middle of the country. They worry about jobs, about putting food on the table, about where they're going to live, about healthcare, about safety in the streets, about their families, whether they're going to be able to afford college. And that's particularly true in the part of the country where I grew up. Now, Craig grew up in California and in LA. Decades ago, we had the smog problem and people responded. My background's a little different. I grew up in South Bend, Indiana, an auto company, and my grandparents lived in Gary, Indiana, which at that time was one of the fastest growing cities in the country because it was a steel mill center. And people from all over the country, and particularly the migrations from the South, came up to Gary for jobs. And I remember, those people really didn't think very much or care very much about the environment. They wanted their jobs because they were the high paying jobs in the country. I remember I used to stay at my grandparents' house in the summer, and they lived in the shadow of the US steel mills. And every morning my grandmother would clean the windowsill. Wipe it clean. And by the end of the day, there'd be a thick layer of soot on the windowsill. She cleaned it again. They didn't really think very much about it because, steel was essential for the economy of Gary. My grandfather was in the junk business. His livelihood depended on the success of the mills. That sort of formed, I think, a lot of the thinking that probably we're still having to get over today. The post-World War II massive economic growth was not built with the environment in mind. I mean, think about it. What was the main thing that triggered it? Among other things, it was the interstate highway system. It was the development of suburbs. All of those built America's romance with the automobile and the necessity to drive to work. All of that depended on fossil fuel, and that has contributed dramatically to the climate change problems. Now we all change, of course, and because circumstances have changed. 2 years ago, I moved from the shore, Thomas Point in Annapolis, south of Annapolis, into downtown Annapolis. And one of the reasons I did is because what Craig talked about, rising seas. I just got tired of water halfway up my backyard every time there was a storm. And when hot tides were particularly high approaching my house. You know, this year we've had the fires in the west, the floods in the south and the east, incredible hurricanes. I think that has awakened many people to the problems of climate change and will eventually change the political debate. How do we change it? I think it's important for our national leaders to show some foresight, but in every time there's a disaster, a natural disaster, they've got to tie it to climate change. I'm hopeful that in the reconciliation bill and in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there will be important climate change measures, but it's just the beginning. I mean, this has got to be probably our number one priority over the next decade, but it's going to take tough, foresighted political leadership to get us there.
Flipping back over to Craig, you know, the other thing is that this is not like our own budget crisis or something else that internally we can kind of fix politically. We have to engage the whole world.
Well, you know, you're absolutely right. It's a global issue and it has to be addressed globally. And indeed, one of I think the concerns people in the United States have had is that if we do everything we're asked to do and sacrifice, it doesn't make that big a difference if other countries aren't jumping into this. But I think they must. They all, of course, suffer from the same political issues that we do here, which is this is a long-term problem. I do think, even going back to my example in Nantucket for a minute, that the organization that is looking at resilience in Nantucket is not a government agency. It's a non-government agency, a non-government organization, a not-for-profit organization. And we have organizations like that globally. The World Economic Forum, if it's going to be utilized for anything, ought to be focused on this kind of global warming issue, because the very companies that participate in that around the world do have a long-term perspective, do have a long-term interest. I mean, and it's those economic interests that have led one industry I'm very much familiar with is the aerospace industry. Our jet engines today are quieter and far more efficient than they were a decade ago, and even, you know, greater than 2 decades ago. And it's all driven because of the desire to manufacture and sell aircraft with engines that are accepted in communities that can go long distances with burning less fuel. And so those kinds of economic interests, I think, have to be brought into play here. You have to find people with long-term interests, companies that face long-term consequences, like anybody around the water. It must become more involved and more informed and more engaged in this discussion. But it is a global issue. If anything comes out of, and there's probably several things that'll be, you know, come out that are good with terms of our pandemic, global pandemic with COVID virus. Maybe we learn more about how to literally form a national coalition to address a big global problem. But it is going to take that kind of commitment, I think, by leading officials across the globe, by industry across the globe, to just to slow this down, because the consequences are headed our way. There's no doubt about that. But to slow it down and hopefully, you know, create a better world decades ahead, we have to take action now.
We're going to have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thanks so much. We'll see you next time.